You're watching Your World at 10. Now, it's being called the most important election in a generation for Great Britain. After 13 years in power, Labour, led by Gordon Brown, is seeking an unprecedented fourth term in office in the general elections that will be held next Thursday. For 10 of those 13 years, Brown was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Conservatives are using that to lay the blame for the recession on Brown's doorstep. Well, to talk more about why this election is so crucial for the British economy, joining us is Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times. Martin, thank you very much for joining us. It seems somehow that the prospect of a hung parliament, which is what everybody seems to be forecasting, doesn't make you as nervous as it has made other political and economic commentators. Why is that?
Well, the main reason is I'm not convinced that even if a government emerged with a significant majority, it would do the tough things it needs to do. It would still probably have less than 40% of the votes. It wouldn't really be very legitimate, and it would have to do things that would create huge public unrest, I think, and particularly in the government services. In a hung parliament, however, a government will have to get the support of other parties, certainly one other party. It's more likely then that the government will represent a majority of the population. I think that will give it more legitimacy, and I see no reason from experience in other countries why a minority government or a coalition government should not be able to implement the sorts of policies that will clearly be needed to get us out of our current situation.
Absolutely, why not? We've been living with coalition politics in India for a long time. Martin, if it is to be a coalition in Britain, who do you think most likely are going to be the partners of that coalition?
At the moment, and it has to be a guess, I think it looks more likely to be the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. I actually think a minority government may be more likely with outside support, but if it's coalition, it looks at it's likely to be this. It seems likely that the Conservatives will have the largest share of the vote. And that would make it difficult for the Liberal Democrats to keep Labour in power. Labour is largely discredited and unpopular after 13 years in power. The Liberal Democrats have clearly positioned themselves to go either way. That maximises their room for manoeuvre, so they're not so clearly in the Labour camp as they would have been, say, 10 years ago. And David Cameron is a relatively liberal-minded sort of conservative. He's not very right-wing. He's clearly positioned himself more to the centre. So it seems to me that the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives should be able to work together. So that seems to me the most likely outcome. But it is still conceivable, if that doesn't work out, that the Liberal Democrats would go with Labour.
Martin, like many others, you're quite entirely ruling out the possibility of Gordon Brown coming back to power.
Yes, on the polls that I've been seeing, that looks pretty well inconceivable, and anything can happen. Elections are very unpredictable. What people do on the day is always difficult to foresee, and there could be tactical voting, which has very profound results in marginal constituencies. But the general expectation is that Labour will emerge without a majority. And in this situation, it seems to me that it would be quite difficult for them to form a stable government. They would have been seen to have been rejected by the electorate. They are in power. They would have been rejected. And it would seem, in this situation, likely at least, that we would end up with a new government. Now, that might be changed if Gordon Brown were to resign and Labour were to agree then on a new leader. That might be seen as sufficiently new so that if it emerges the largest single party, it could still have a reasonable claim to remain in government. But it seems to me that's also unlikely. They don't have an obvious alternative candidate. If they had, Gordon Brown would probably have already gone in the last 2 years. So it seems to me very improbable on what I'm seeing that Labour will emerge as the government.
Martin, one of your group publications, the FT's group publication, The Economist, has very recently shifted loyalties and decided to openly support David Cameron. Which party or leader, based on everything that you're reading of their promises, are you backing? Because you think their policies will most benefit the economy, especially the strict discipline that's required on spending for Britain to come back on track.
Well, the answer to that is I have made a conscious decision not to back anyone. I thought about it in my column this morning. I mean, the truth is, it seems to me that none of the parties on offer are in themselves enormously attractive. It's not at all clear which of these three parties will be toughest on spending, will deal with the economic problems most effectively. You can make arguments in favour of any one of them. I actually would prefer a coalition government in this situation, probably a coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. I think they offset each other's weaknesses reasonably well, so that I probably would agree more with the overall programme of a Conservative Liberal Democratic coalition than I would agree with the programme of either of these parties on their own. The Liberal Democrats, to my mind, are far too pro-European, even want to put us in the euro, which would be a catastrophe in my view. On the other hand, the Conservatives are very anti-European. They haven't got well worked out tax policies, and I think if the Conservatives took on public spending, they are likely to find that very difficult to do because of the resistance from unions. So actually, personally, I would quite like such a coalition. I can't, of course, vote for it. There's no way you can vote for such a thing, but that seems to me, from my point of view, the most desirable outcome.
But it's interesting, neither of these parties plans to revive the economy or cut spending, Martin, seem to find much confidence in you, do they?
No. Well, everybody knows it's been very well explained in a superb recent report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is the premier think tank looking at fiscal policy problems in the UK. Everybody knows that of the scale of the cuts we need, possibly in the neighbourhood of £70 billion over the next 5, 6, 7 years. A very small proportion has already been indicated in detail by any of the parties, so it's a huge black box. Nobody knows what's going to be in it. But in this respect, there isn't any big difference between the parties. None of them has been in any way really honest about the spending cuts that will come along, nor have they really been sufficiently honest or intelligent, in my view, about the tax increases, which will also clearly be required. So essentially, this is an election in which you are being asked to support parties without any real idea at all of how they would tackle the biggest challenges facing the country. And that is why I find it impossible to support any one of them.
So it's quite clear, Martin, that in the condition that the UK economy currently is, the economy is going to be at the centre of this election. But if you're finding it tough to actually pick between the policies of these parties or identify a policy that you like, what in heavens are voters going to be able to use to be able to go out there and vote come Thursday?
I think that's a very good question. I think the answer, which is probably true in most democratic elections, I think that's true in India too, is who do you trust most? You don't understand the details of policy. It's a question of trust. And here too, the three leaders, unfortunately, all have very big disadvantages. Gordon Brown is in many ways a competent and impressive man, but he clearly bears very heavy responsibility for the vulnerability of the UK to the crisis. We would have had a recession anyway, there was no doubt about it, but he made very serious mistakes before the crisis, though I think he handled the crisis itself really quite impressively. David Cameron and Nick Clegg are unknown quantities. Neither of them has ever held serious power. They've never been in a government at any level before. So from the voters' point of view, they're nice, attractive, fresh-faced, youngish men, young middle-aged men, but who knows whether they are really trustworthy. One of the problems we have is that two of the leaders on offer are so completely inexperienced, which was, of course, also the problem we had in '97 when Blair and Brown came into power. So essentially, the choice, as I put it in one of my columns, is between a party and a leader about whom we know too much and other parties and leaders about whom we know far too little. And in this situation, it really is a matter of hunch, of judgment of each voter on whom you're going to trust. And it's not obvious to me, I have to say.
Martin, finally, I do want your view on how this election is going to impact everything that's going on in the eurozone right now. I know you pointed out that the Lib Dems are more Eurocentric, the Conservatives more Eurosceptic. But can you give us a sense of the outcome of this election and the impact, or how it's going to play in with what's going on in Greece, Spain, with Germany dragging its feet and coming to the rescue of many of these beleaguered economies?
My instinct is that it won't make much difference. The UK is a bystander. It's outside the eurozone, and in practice, I think there's absolutely zero chance that the UK will join the eurozone, should it survive, for, as it were, the indefinite future. I don't think that's part of realistic politics, and I think that's perfectly sensible. For that reason, the members of the eurozone will fix their affairs as best they can, largely ignoring the UK. The UK is not going to be disruptive. I think it's very unlikely to be. It has no real basis for being. On the other hand, it's not going to be any help. Now, in the longer term, it might make a difference, and not in the context of this crisis, but whether the UK can play a reasonably constructive role, even a slightly semi-detached constructive role in the European Union more widely, or an essentially obstructive role, that does make a difference. And there is no doubt that the Conservative Party is a profoundly Eurosceptic party. David Cameron himself is, I think, not so extreme, and they are therefore likely to find themselves in many conflicts with their European partners, and Nick Clegg and, to some degree, Gordon Brown are on the opposite side. So in that wider, longer-term context, I think it makes a difference, because I am very personally keen on not being in the Eurozone, but being an active player inside the European Union. I don't think we should consider leaving. I find this aspect of extreme Euroscepticism in the Conservative Party really rather troublesome.
Martin, final question then. If Britain does end up with a coalition government by the end of next week, and if that coalition is made up of the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, as you pointed out, what is the likely stability of that coalition going to be? Because, I mean, the big problem with coalition governments is instability. And for an economy that's desperately trying to get back onto the recovery track, that can be very, very disturbing.
I think that's a very good question. Coalition governments have different histories of performance across the world. It might be very bad, it might be very temporary. My assumption here is whether it's a coalition government or a minority government with outside support, an experience that you're familiar with, is can they agree a common programme? The common programme would have to have at its core a fiscal programme, and since it's a multi-year programme, unavoidably a multi-year programme, it has to be one that they are going to be able to deliver over several years, and that means the government must be able to survive enormous pressure, because I expect a very fierce backlash against any of these proposals. I think realistically it is quite possible that such a government would crumble and break, and we would then have another election. But looking at the electoral arithmetic in the UK at the moment, it's quite likely that another election would have quite a similar outcome, unless the Labour Party rejuvenated itself in opposition, which is where I assume it will be. I should stress, however, that if you look at the situation today in the UK, as I think it's been reported that Mervyn King, the Governor of the Bank of England, has just said, you would think that any sensible politician would want to lose it, because whoever wins this election is going to have to do things, whether in coalition or on its own, which will be desperately unpopular with the public.
Now, such as cutting spending over the longer term and bringing the fiscal deficit back into control. Well, Martin, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Welcome to the way coalition politics works in India and across